There are moments in history when the glittering brilliance of kingship conceals something far darker than the public ever sees. Behind the golden mirrors of Versailles, beneath chandeliers that sparkled with thousands of candles, and along marble floors polished to reflect eternity, a truth was buried. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, was adored as a living god. His beauty, his charm, and his power were thought to be everlasting. To his contemporaries, he was not just a monarch, but the very embodiment of divine perfection walking the earth. Yet, hidden away from the public gaze, the man who dazzled the world with his magnificence would meet a fate too grotesque to imagine. The same king who seemed untouchable, who represented the very pinnacle of royal glory, would, in the end, rot alive in front of his courtiers. The godlike sovereign of Europe would be reduced to a decaying corpse whose very presence was so unbearable that courtiers gagged, diplomats fled meetings, and masks soaked in perfume became necessary just to endure his proximity. Louis XIV was hailed as the most beautiful king Europe had ever seen. His body was perfectly proportioned, his charisma overwhelming. He could dance ballet for 6 hours straight without breaking a sweat, and foreign ambassadors literally swooned in his presence. He was a man of talents far beyond appearance. He spoke French, Latin, Italian, Spanish, and German fluently. He remembered the names and details of thousands of nobles, dazzling those around him with his memory. His sheer confidence, his way of walking through a room, and his aura made him seem carved from another realm. But that same brilliance was destined to collapse into something monstrous, a cruel reminder that time humbles even the greatest of kings. In his youth, Louis represented everything that absolute monarchy wanted to project. May 1661, Versailles. The Sun King, at just 23 years old, descended the palace staircase in ceremonial robes embroidered with real gold thread, weighing more than 30 pounds. A crowd of 5,000 nobles fell into silence, their breath caught as they beheld their king. Nearly 5'8", with rippling muscles, gleaming black hair, and piercing blue eyes, he seemed more like a god than a man. The afternoon sunlight streamed through crystal windows, reflecting from Venetian mirrors, multiplying his image infinitely. Courtiers whispered that even the hardwood floors seemed to vibrate under his confident stride. His voice carried with such power that it was heard from 150 feet away. People described his eyes as stars, shooting through the souls of all who looked at him. His natural scent was so intoxicating that courtiers fainted in his presence. To them, he was not just a monarch, he was divinity embodied in flesh. Louis was not merely a beautiful spectacle. He was highly educated, fluent in languages, skilled in fencing, and unmatched in the arts of performance. He could outduel the greatest Italian masters, then dance until dawn without exhaustion. He wrote poetry that brought hardened ambassadors to tears. His stamina was legendary, hunting wild boar for hours, consuming immense meals, yet maintaining a physique sculpted like marble. His memory was terrifyingly sharp. He could recall the names, families, and histories of thousands of courtiers, cementing his control over the court. His charisma was so overwhelming that it disarmed rivals, melted political opposition, and enchanted every visitor who walked through the palace gates. At Versailles, nobles fought over the smallest gestures of service. At the morning lever ceremony, grown men clawed for the privilege of handing him his silk shirt, pouring his water, tying his shoes. In the evening coucher, they scrambled just for the honor of blowing out his candle. The palace was designed as a theater, every detail meant to glorify the king. In the Hall of Mirrors, his reflection multiplied into infinity, a visual trick that convinced onlookers they were in the presence of something eternal. Even the marble beneath his feet was imported from Italy at a cost that today would equal millions, so that each of his footsteps echoed with imperial authority. But beneath this golden performance, cracks had already begun to show. Hidden medical records, decoded centuries later, revealed disturbing truths. By his mid-20s, Louis required multiple enemas every day just to relieve himself, a result of compulsive overeating. His breath was foul, barely hidden by peppermint candies. His skin, oily and scarred, was concealed beneath layers of powder and rouge. He suffered from chronic digestive problems requiring constant intervention. And, perhaps most dangerous of all, he refused to bathe, convinced that water weakened the body and invited spirits. Louis only washed his face and hands daily. His body, apart from 2 known occasions, never touched water. He believed his natural scent was proof of masculine power, but in reality, it became the fertile ground for infection. This single decision, to reject cleansing as weakness, would directly lead to his ruin. January 1686 marked the turning point. At 47, Louis complained to his physician about discomfort when sitting. The doctor dismissed it as simple hemorrhoids. Within days, the discomfort became unbearable. The swelling grew to the size of a walnut, bleeding and festering. By February, pus and foul matter leaked constantly, soaking through his garments. Courtiers gagged at the smell, and foreign diplomats vomited in meetings. Versailles, once a temple of light, became filled with the stench of decay. The Sun King's godlike aura was unraveling. Treatments began, but they were brutal, medieval tortures masquerading as medicine. Thousands of freezing cold enemas were forced upon him, more than 2,000 within 6 months. When those failed, doctors turned to red-hot cauterization, metal rods heated until they glowed, pressed against his flesh as courtiers held him down, his screams echoing through the palace. Still, the infection spread. Bloodletting followed. Half a liter drained from his body every single day until he grew weak and pale. Charlatans whispered false cures, and Louis submitted in desperation. Bull sperm mixed with wine, crushed pearls stirred into blood, frog fat dissolved in brandy. Each remedy more absurd, more revolting, and utterly useless. The man who had once embodied divine perfection, who strode through the hall of mirrors like a god among mortals, was now reduced to a shadow. He endured endless agony, hidden beneath perfumes and protocol, clinging to an image of majesty that his body could no longer sustain. The courtiers who once fought to serve him now fled from his presence. His decline was not only physical, it was symbolic. The Sun King became a grotesque warning that even the most radiant monarchs are powerless against the decay of flesh. Louis XIV, the golden prince who once commanded Europe with his beauty, charisma, and strength, died bloated, toothless, and consumed by rot. His story, hidden for centuries, is not just the tale of one king's suffering. It is a reminder that power and glory cannot shield anyone from the ultimate truth. Beneath the robes of gold and the crowns of diamonds, every king is still only mortal. By November of 1686, Louis XIV's condition could no longer be concealed. The magnificent aura of the Sun King, who once dazzled Europe with his vitality and elegance, had been eclipsed by an odor so overwhelming that it began driving away the very diplomats who once competed for an audience at Versailles. The situation had reached a breaking point. Courtiers whispered, physicians panicked, and the king himself endured unimaginable suffering. What came next was not merely a medical intervention. It became one of the most shocking episodes of surgical history, a tale of desperation, cruelty, and survival that would forever scar the image of France's most famous monarch. At the heart of this drama stood Charles François Félix, the royal surgeon. He was no stranger to the impossible, but never before had his craft demanded so much. The fate of the most powerful monarch in Europe now rested in his hands. Failure would not just mean disgrace. It would almost certainly mean execution. To prepare himself, Felix resorted to a practice so disturbing that it horrifies even modern readers. For months he rehearsed his procedure on living human beings, 75 prisoners, and condemned men used as unwilling test subjects. 3 to 4 times each week, he performed trial surgeries, perfecting his technique while men screamed and writhed in agony. Out of this gruesome training came a specialized weapon of healing and torture combined, a curved silver scalpel, crafted specifically for slicing into the king's infected body. On the morning of November 18, 1686, the Palace of Versailles held its breath. At 6 a.m., through secret passages, Felix and his chosen assistants entered Louis XIV private chambers. The air was heavy with dread. There was no anesthesia, no true pain relief, only 4 trusted courtiers to hold down the king's arms and legs, and a block of wood for him to bite during the agony to come. The surgery began, and immediately the chamber filled with sounds and smells that tested the endurance of everyone present. Felix's scalpel cut into the festering abscess, and with each slice, Louis XIV remained conscious, his face contorted with unimaginable pain. The stench that burst forth was so revolting that 2 assistants staggered away and vomited into corners of the room. Blood soaked the royal sheets, spraying like a crimson fountain with every deeper incision. The ordeal lasted 3 hours. At precisely 9:15 a.m., as the blade scraped against bone near the tailbone, the Sun King himself, who had endured silently until then, let out a cry that shook Versailles. "Mon Dieu!" he screamed, the words echoing through the palace corridors, sending tremors of fear through the gathered attendants. Later discovered notes from Felix revealed the gruesome detail. Over 200 milliliters of green-blue pus drained from the wound, reeking of rotting corpses. The infection had eaten into bone itself, revealing a body already at war with decay. But this nightmare was not finished. Instead of one surgery, Louis XIV would endure 3 more. December 6th brought the second operation, December 8th the third, and December 10th the final, most brutal procedure. That last surgery alone lasted 6 hours, performed while the king remained fully awake, his body restrained by 6 strong men as Felix carved further and further. Across 3 weeks, the total surgical time reached 15 hours. Enough diseased tissue was cut away to fill an entire wine bowl. By the end, Louis XIV had endured torment on a scale that defies comprehension, and yet his suffering was far from over. When the wounds finally showed signs of closing, physicians hailed it as a miracle, a triumph of royal resilience. But the truth was far darker. The surgery left Louis with a permanent anal fistula, a wound that never fully healed. For the rest of his life, pus and waste leaked constantly from his body. The monarch, once celebrated for his intoxicating scent, now reeked of corruption and rot. Foreign envoys who once scrambled for his attention began avoiding him. In secret letters, the Venetian ambassador confessed that entering the king's presence was like stepping into a charnel house. The king's response was desperate and costly. He transformed Versailles into the most perfumed palace in history. Vast sums, modern equivalents of millions, were spent on Bulgarian roses, Arabian ambergris, Indian sandalwood, and countless exotic fragrances. Flowers were replaced every 2 hours. Perfume burners smoked continuously, and servants sprayed every piece of furniture before he sat down. Even the meals served to him were infused with aromatic oils in a futile attempt to mask the smell of decay. Versailles, once a symbol of magnificence, had become a fortress against a stench no perfume could truly conquer. Meanwhile, Louis's body continued to betray him. The trauma of repeated surgeries left him unable to exercise, and his once athletic frame began to swell. From 165 pounds in his youth, his weight climbed steadily to 265 by 1700, then to a staggering 310 pounds by 1710. The king, who had once danced ballet with grace, now needed 6 men to hoist him onto a horse. His throne had to be rebuilt multiple times as he grew larger. Portraitists painted him carefully, hiding the truth with brushstrokes, but visitors wrote cruel observations. One Russian ambassador sneered that the king smelled worse than a horse and moved like a pregnant cow. Then came the disaster of 1693, a medical catastrophe that completed the monarch's physical ruin. Believing all illness stemmed from bad teeth, his doctor extracted every tooth from the king's mouth in one monstrous session. Without anesthesia, using crude iron tools, The procedure tore apart not only his gums, but also part of his upper palate, fracturing his jaw. Louis was left with a permanent hole between his mouth and nasal cavity. Food and drink now gushed from his nose when he tried to eat. His speech became slurred and garbled. Saliva dribbled constantly from his lips, forcing courtiers to endure his foul breath just to hear his words. By this stage, the Sun King bore little resemblance to the golden monarch who had once captivated Europe. He was obese, toothless, leaking from his mouth and body alike, a grotesque parody of his former self. Yet Versailles would not allow the myth of divinity to collapse. Elaborate rituals were invented to shield his condition from the world. Courtiers used a ribbon code. Red meant the king was in agony and no one should approach. White signaled limited access with perfumed masks, and black marked the worst days of his bowel afflictions. Ceremonies were shortened, curtains drawn, and hidden protocols designed to manage the constant leakage of his fistula. The palace itself became a living theater of deception. Air currents were engineered to blow the king's odor away from guests. 500 bowls of fresh flowers were rotated daily. 50 perfume machines burned ceaselessly, creating clouds of scented smoke. Courtiers carried pomanders and cloths soaked in aromatic oils to press against their noses when near the king. Visitors endured in silence, but behind closed doors, letters and diaries spoke the truth. The Sun King, once radiant and untouchable, was rotting in plain sight. At Versailles, appearances were everything. Every gesture, every ritual, every glance was meant to reflect the glory of the monarch. But behind the glittering facade of Louis XIV's court, something far more disturbing lingered. The king's physical decay had grown so overwhelming that the most delicate ladies of the court could no longer bear it. After mandatory audiences, they would excuse themselves with claims of sudden feminine ailments. Yet the truth was too obvious to those who dared to whisper. They were sickened by their own sovereign, the man who called himself the Sun King. The rot of Louis XIV was no private matter. It seeped into the realm of international politics. Foreign ambassadors who once competed for an audience now struggled to endure them. The English ambassador, in a move that shocked courtiers, requested permission to conduct meetings outdoors, citing his health. The Spanish representative avoided the ordeal entirely, sending lower-ranking diplomats in his place. Across Europe, whispers began to spread. If the King of France could not control his own body, how could he control a kingdom? Was the Sun King truly fit to rule when he could no longer command even the most basic bodily functions? Yet despite the visible signs of decay, Louis held tightly to the fiction of divine monarchy. The more his body betrayed him, the more desperate he became to maintain the performance of absolute authority. Every protocol, every ceremony, every aspect of court life grew increasingly elaborate, designed not to glorify him, but to conceal what he had become. The most powerful monarch in Europe, the man who had styled himself as godlike, was now hiding the fact that his body was literally rotting away. The full extent of his torment began on August 11th, 1715. At 4:30 in the morning, Versailles was shaken awake by a piercing scream. Louis XIV cried out in agony, his left leg aflame with a pain that felt as though fire itself had taken root within his flesh. Doctors rushed to his bedside. Among them was Dr. Fagan, the royal physician, a man 72 years old, nearly blind, and by all accounts incompetent. His verdict was simple: sciatica, a nerve condition caused by sitting too long. What he failed to recognize, or perhaps dared not say, was that this was no passing pain. It was the beginning of senile gangrene, a condition that would consume the king alive. At first, the signs were subtle. By August 15th, black spots appeared on the king's big toe. Within 3 days, the discoloration spread, the flesh burning hot to the touch. By August 22nd, a new odor filled the royal bedchamber. It was not the familiar stench of pus and waste, but something worse, something unmistakable, the smell of rotting human flesh. Servants, accustomed to unpleasant tasks, now collapsed upon entering the room. Perfume, once a luxury at Versailles, became a necessity. Gallons of it burned and splashed in a futile attempt to mask the corruption of the king's body. By August 25th, even Dr. Fagin could no longer deny the truth. The gangrene had spread halfway up Louis's foot, and the stench was so overwhelming that courtiers wore perfumed masks when approaching him. Modern medical experts later confirmed that amputation might have saved his life, but such a suggestion was unthinkable at the time. Who among his physicians would dare propose severing the leg of a man who claimed to be appointed by God himself? The horror accelerated with shocking speed. On August 28th, the king's big toe detached entirely, slipping off as servants attempted to change his stockings. The sight of exposed white bone pushing through rotting flesh sent courtiers into fits of nausea. 2 days later, the gangrene reached his shin, and the smell had spread so widely that 3 floors of Versailles were permeated with the stench of death. Still, unbelievably, Louis XIV continued to rule. This is what makes his decline so extraordinary. Even as his body failed him in the most grotesque ways, he refused to surrender the performance of power. He signed decrees with trembling hands while pieces of his body decayed. He received ambassadors while the odor of death poured from him. His voice grew hoarse, his breath raspy, as the gangrene crept closer to his throat. The Venetian ambassador wrote in disbelief, "The French king is dying by degrees before our very eyes." The Austrian representative called it the most gruesome spectacle he had ever witnessed. Yet still the ceremonies continued. By the end of August, the king's condition had turned into a living nightmare. His bed linens had to be changed every 2 hours as fluids seeped from the rotting tissue. 20 servants rotated in shifts to care for him, but many begged for reassignment, unable to endure the stench. Visitors in the palace gardens, hundreds of yards away, could smell the corruption wafting from the king's chambers. Foreign physicians traveled from across Europe, not to save him, but to witness what they knew would be remembered as the most infamous royal death in history. By September, the destruction was total. His leg, once strong from years of dancing and riding, was now a battlefield of blackened flesh, exposed bone, and oozing sores. Chunks of tissue sloughed off during routine care, each piece a grotesque reminder that even kings could rot like common men. On September 1st, his final day, Louis could barely speak. The gangrene had reached his throat, and each word scraped out of him like sandpaper. He summoned his great-grandson and whispered a warning. "Do not imitate me. I have loved war too much." That morning, at 8:15 a.m., the Sun King's heart stopped beating. But even in death, his suffering did not end. His corpse swelled grotesquely within hours, bloated by gases of decay. 6 hours later, physicians rushed to conduct the autopsy before the body collapsed entirely. The findings were staggering. The entire left side of his body was consumed by gangrene. His throat muscles were blackened with decay. His intestines, twice their normal length, held an enormous tapeworm that had lived inside him for years. The embalming team faced an impossible task. The king's body was decomposing too rapidly to preserve. Assistants worked with masks soaked in perfume, yet many fled the chamber vomiting. The coffin had to be sealed at once, reinforced with lead, because the corpse continued to swell. During the lying-in state, courtiers reported hearing popping and gurgling noises from within the sealed casket as the Sun King's body literally fell apart. And then came the cover-up. Official announcements told the people of France that their monarch had died peacefully after a brief illness. The truth was deemed too horrifying to reveal. Within days, the evidence was erased. Dr. Fagin's records were burned. Dr. Felix's surgical diaries vanished for centuries. Import logs of perfume shipments used to mask the royal stench were scrubbed from existence. The autopsy report was buried in archives until its rediscovery in 1891. Louis XIV, the monarch who had styled himself as the Sun King, who built Versailles as a monument to his magnificence, died not as a god, but as a rotting husk of flesh devoured by his own body. The irony was inescapable. He who claimed divine appointment and absolute authority, died more degraded than the poorest peasant, his body consuming itself while his mind remained trapped in the horror until the very end. This is the true legacy of Louis XIV. Not just a ruler of grandeur, not just the architect of Versailles, but a man whose arrogance and refusal to face reality doomed him to one of the most grotesque deaths in royal history. Modern experts agree his suffering could have been prevented. A simple amputation, proper hygiene, basic medical care could have saved him. Instead, the belief in divine monarchy and royal immunity condemned him to 3 weeks of unimaginable agony. The lesson is clear. Absolute power may control nations, armies, and empires, but it cannot control the one truth that unites all humanity. No crown, no palace, no divine claim can shield anyone from decay, from death, from the fragility of the human body. The Sun King, once the most radiant figure in Europe, ended his reign as a spectacle of rot, a warning to every ruler who believes themselves untouchable. And so, the story of Louis XIV remains not only a tale of magnificence, but a reminder of mortality. A man who ruled as though he were appointed by God himself could not escape the most basic truth of all. Absolute power is powerless against time, against disease, and against death itself.